Welcome to the Business of Family, the podcast where we explore the stories, challenges, and opportunities of family businesses. I'm your host, Tammy Buss, and I'm a family business survivor, and I'm also a family business advisor. In this show, we'll be talking with family business leaders and experts to bring you insights and inspiration so you too can survive your family business journey. Whether you're a founder, a successor, a professional, or just curious about family business, this podcast is for you. So welcome back, Chris.
Thank you, Tammy. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Yeah, so today's episode's a little bit different. We're actually going to discuss a family case that's been in the papers, and I'm not, probably everybody has read it, but boy, oh boy, is it ever interesting.
It's a really interesting case, and it's got a lot of moving parts. I think a lot of moving parts in this area of conversation around family enterprise that provide lessons as well as some insights about things that maybe could have been done and maybe shouldn't have been done. It brings back a lot of memories for me over the years of the work that I've done. I've had at least two situations that were evolving down pathways that could have looked a lot like this, but fortunately went a slightly different direction, which simply highlights how a lot of these situations are incredibly dynamic and fact-dependent.
They really are. So for our listeners, we're talking about the Libfield case. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Libfield case out of Toronto. And this is a dad, Teddy, who started his business and grew it and passed away. And ultimately the four boys who became owners got into a bit of a mess. So let's start at the beginning. So Teddy came over to Canada, with his brother with nothing, and left. He was supposed to be killed in the Auschwitz, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, so his entire family, he and his brother were the only two survivors of the Holocaust from their family. And he came here and tried a few different things and then settled in finally on land development and built himself what ultimately became, I mean, as you read the case, we only get the information as it is presented sort of post-forensically, but so it's not, we don't always know everything about it, but ultimately it sounds like the business was worth about $4 billion.
About $4 billion. And you think, wow, with a $4 billion business, you think you'd have, all your ducks in a row. You've got so many advisors around you. But let's go back and talk about, what happened with Teddy. So just to give you the background, I guess, for our listeners. So Teddy had come over, escaped, hid his tattoos, hid the fact he was Jewish, managed to escape, get to Canada. Him and his brother started a business. And then one of his sons came in. Right, the first son, I think, was Sheldon, who came into the business. And I do believe it was Jay who came in. He had a degree. I think he's the only one. I think that, Sheldon. Sorry, Sheldon had a degree. Jay was the first one in the business. So Jay was the first one in the business. Yeah. Sheldon had a degree. I have to look at the names because I keep forgetting. Mark had a partial degree or left university. Yes. And then the youngest brother, Corey, came in at age 17. So you had these four brothers in the business working with Dad who had a lot of respect for Dad. But I'm sure I don't have siblings, so I don't really get this, but I know my husband has 9 siblings, so he gets this. You remember things, that first hire, the one with the degree, the one that got in without schooling. Like, there's all these things that come into play when you're, your sibling. So I can't imagine this, but I think this sort of comes out a little bit, right? So anyway, here we go. We got 4 brothers working with Dad who have a lot of respect for Dad.
Yes.
And maybe you can talk a little bit about
and that respect. When you I remember reading. I mentioned to you prior to us starting the podcast here today. I had read this case when it was first reported, and I'd forgotten about it. Mm-hmm. And when you wanted to discuss it and shared with me some of the supporting material in preparation for this, I was refreshed, and then I remembered how sad the story was, and what you had was this business that was forged out of the, really the destruction and the horrific experiences that Teddy, the father, had of loss from World War II. And what you begin to see is how a legacy is developed around that entire model of fear of loss. Taking nothing, the achievement of building a $4 billion business cannot, you can't unrecognize that. That's an amazing thing. But the mindset that was in behind it, you see, at least I thought I was seeing permeating a lot of the interaction between the four siblings, and then the father's interaction with each of the four siblings as told in the story, was very much one kind of mindset associated with a fear of loss.
Yes, and I think he does say, in some of the articles are out, there's a lot of articles flipping around about this if you want to read, but I think he talked about with his boys the fact that, he's seen families self-destruct and, blow everything that they've earned, and, having come through, like living through the Holocaust and not, not, or being spared, I guess is more the word, but to be able to, zip out of the line somehow and come here and raise this wonderful family and this great big business, that he didn't want to see it destroyed.
Right.
So he talked a lot from the readings, talked a lot about, keeping it in the family and, being mindful of the growth and understanding and working together. And
well, they never, by the sounds of it, had a formal policy for the extraction of value from the business. Everything got reinvested in the business.
Yes, they self-funded, like they put the money back in, so they didn't have to get bank loans. They were able to fund whatever project they wanted, and they were involved in things like high-rise buildings, condos, commercial buildings, residential. And they also had, I think, a business that actually supplied the equipment and the materials and the design, or, the interiors to the
I think
projects.
the youngest son actually ran
so it was
the design
all in house, right? And so sort of each brother had a division that they were sort of in, or, knew the most about. So it was interesting that, there are four divisions, four brothers. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but, so you have this $4 billion business, and Dad had, the boys had asked him, I guess, at some point about succession planning. And he said, look, I just don't want this business destroyed. I've seen too many families, blow it. And one of the kids said, well, what happens if we can't make a decision? And he said, then you'll just fight it out.
Which is, at the end of the day, a complete bump. A complete abdication of any sort of responsibility that goes with. I don't know how you feel, Tammy, but I think a big part of ownership of assets is a stewardship responsibility. And you have a responsibility, whether it's a business or a cottage, to help steward that on to the next generation, which we might call that legacy building, but you have some responsibility to deal with that, because if you don't, then everyone's left with their own perceptions of right and wrong and what Dad wanted.
Absolutely.
And the wife in this case, who was still alive through most of the narrative, she, the mother of the four boys, she very much was of that mindset as well. This is what your father would have wanted. At least that was the impression.
That's the impression you got, right? And interesting, when the boys, when Dad was alive, because he died in 2000, he died at 72, so he was quite young.
Yeah.
Died at 72. And the boys were each left a quarter of the business. And you're thinking, okay, there's four businesses when you just divide them up. But anyway, Dad dies. And prior to Dad dying, they were able to make decisions together.
Just by consensus,
right? And I think what you forget is that if you are an owner of a business and you come in and you start this business, it's very easy to make decisions because you make the final decision. It's your baby. You're going to raise it the way you want, right? It's your ball. You're going to go home if you don't like the rules.
That's right.
And you forget that when you now put in several different personalities, that's going to change. And everybody's going to think they're right. When it's easy when you are the only right, or Dad is the right, like Dad gets the ultimate decision. But when you have three equals, and you disagree.
Yes.
Or sorry, 4 equals, and they all disagree. Who's the leader? When you have a parent, there's a leader. And I think Dad just assumed they would all continue the same way once he passed, which is not the case at all. No, or we wouldn't be talking about it.
We wouldn't be here today. And the issues changed dramatically over time, too. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that, there's a myriad of things that they forgot to, or deliberately omitted to deal with in their succession planning. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was, you've got 4 boys, and they're all 4 kids, and they're all at different stages of life.
Right.
And the business is at different stages of its evolution as well. And so you end up with, one son who's older, has an older family, and then different viewpoints on the world and different fears and biases. And then you've got the youngest son, and we'll skip right down to him, who's got his own worldviews, different timeline for his family. And you really see that in the narrative of the case, that there were these different desires to access the capital, probably being driven by lifestyle and generation, generational differences as well.
Absolutely. And when Dad's alive, of course, you're not going to have these conversations, right?
That's right.
So what's interesting, and by the way, the name of the family business is a conservatory group. I don't know if we mentioned that. So it's a conservatory group that holds all this $4 billion worth of real estate and assets. Anyway, so the boys, after Dad dies in 2000, decide that they really do have to put some mechanisms in place for, how to extract cash, what happens if someone wants out, what are the rules going to be around succession and transition and making decisions and so on and so forth. And they couldn't do it, right? They brought in experts, they couldn't do it. But what's interesting is at the very beginning, because each of the brothers ran a division of this conservatory group, whenever there was an issue dealing with that particular business, they deferred to the brother who was in charge of that, who was closest to it.
Right.
Because you're like, okay, well, most about this. What do you think is the right or wrong answer on making decisions? So that was kind of easy, right? And we talk about this with families. It doesn't matter how big your business is. There's certain decisions that are easy. But I think where it started to go off the rails, it was when it was a cash withdrawal.
Yes.
When the decision couldn't be about, the decision was how much can you take out? Because remember, they wanted all the cash in the business so that they could fund their own projects. They didn't have to go and get bank loans.
They wanted to keep their powder dry, so that and you get that in the narrative of the story, that they were trying to make sure that when others overextended themselves, or if the market took a dip, they could take advantage of that by having lots of capital and being able to take advantage of the poor planning, perhaps, or opportunities of other people. But that really created, I think, it really squeezed the cash. I think they were living okay lives.
I think they were. I think they had like a couple of $7 million homes.
It sounded like that.
It's not like they're living in poverty here and leaving all the money in the business.
They weren't having flag days for them or anything like that.
But what was interesting is that when you go back to Dad, when Dad was running the business and there were problems in the economy, Dad was helping people fund their projects, or if they couldn't pay zero interest loans, he'd help them buy a house if the market wasn't great. He had that helping, and I don't think his intention was to come here and build this incredible empire. He just had the right core values and grew this because of who he was and what he'd been through, and learning about how the struggles and helping people through, because I'm sure he had help along the way. Getting to Canada, right?
Yes.
So he probably was like, I need to give back, and how can I do this in a way that's meaningful for me and my business and my potential clients?
And you could see those values, those were his values, and the children were trying to live by their father's values, and I presume their mother's values, so it seems to be reflected that way. But their values may have been a little different. They may have had, intruding values that were somewhat paramount to that. And I think when the father died, those gloves came off a little bit, and that self-regulation skill set that they had developed over years broke down a fair bit, and they couldn't function anymore simply hoping to find consensus. And I think your point about them being simple issues, interestingly enough, it was one of the simplest issues of all, life insurance, how to acquire life insurance, that really pushed the ship over the edge of the horizon.
And again, the boys, after their father passed away, started to look at how do we deal with this going forward, because Dad didn't leave us any planning on, how are we to do things. And the one thing they did do, they had 250 companies supposedly. So each project they had became its own incorporated company. So they had a lot of tax strategies in there to sort of defer tax from this year to, a couple of years down the road. And the proverbial kick it down you're eventually going to have to pay it, but you kick it down the road as long as possible. But they did realize that there's huge tax liability when they finally have to pay this, or they sold, or somebody passed away.
Yeah.
And that's when they said, okay, well, there's not enough life insurance here to cover the tax liability, because we want to be able to keep the family business in the family. So if a brother passed away, that at that point the spouse would not inherit the business, but would get the cash in lieu of the business. So they were trying to figure that out. And sometimes the best way to do that, rather than to liquidate the cash you have, is to use life insurance. And so this became a huge battle with them.
Well, and because of their ages and relative
health issues.
Yeah, right? I mean, it wasn't going to cost the same.
No.
And as we all know, the best day to buy life insurance was yesterday, because you were healthier and younger, and it just gets more expensive and more risky every day. And that was what pushed them through. And I'd be interested in your reflection on this, because you see this as well. They did so much tax planning. They had hundreds of business entities. Every time they started a new business or a new construction,
incorporated as another company.
And it was all driven by tax. Yes. None of it was driven by any sort of purposeful, forward-thinking, transitional objectives or values. Right. It was all down to the dollars and cents.
Right.
And when push came to shove, that's what ripped them apart as well. It was focusing too much on that kind of stuff.
And, and I don't think that was Dad's full intention. I mean, I think when you do, separate your companies at the beginning, you're worried about, lawsuits or bankruptcy in one, and it doesn't take the whole kit and caboodle down. But this comes to, first circle around to working with a collaborative team, to make sure that you have everybody on the same page, because the accounting firms are going to try to save you tax. That's what they do. Absolutely. The lawyers are like, put it in a different corp, let's do this, let's focus on protection. But you need somebody to come in and say, what do you really want to do? Which is what you talk about. What is the value? Why are you doing this? Other than just tax? Is there an alternative? And so it's too late. They're already down this path. They have all these companies. And then they have to figure out how we're going to do some of these simple things. Like, okay, what if someone passes? How are we going to manage the tax? How are we going to manage the value to the spouse and family from the value of the businesses? And one of the easiest ways, because they didn't want to liquidate, was to buy insurance. But at this point, one of the brothers had a heart attack.
Yes.
And so his premiums were double. And we're talking not $100,000 of premium here. We're talking $100,000 of face amount. We're talking millions and millions and millions of dollars, like hundreds of millions of dollars of insurance. So, having someone pay double at an older age versus someone younger, this started the conflict of, I don't want to pay your premiums.
Yes. And I've seen that. I've actually bumped into circumstances where that was the problem. And by the time we had been able to get involved with it, we were actually kind of where they were. And it was the cost rather than the ultimate desire for the outcome of the transition of the business as an entity that began to cleave people off of one another. It was the cost. And the cost is an investment. It's a cost of business.
It's a cost of doing business. And they eventually did settle on that, and they did decide to, share the premium, so to speak, and not have one pay it over the other. But another interesting point that, again, people don't think about the little things that start to tear the families apart. They think of the big items, but it's not. In your experience and my experience with clients, it's not the big items. So you have to have a plan. But one of the things they decided, they owned this big building, luxury building, and they decided to take the top 3 floors of the condo. And to so that they agreed, but what they did, which I thought was a good way to do it, and I mean those are the examples of how you can make things work, is they put their names in a hat and drew a name out, and that was based on what floor they got, and they agreed on that, which was interesting. But guess where the fight? You read it, so
I did. That's why I
for our
laughed.
listeners, you'll never guess what a big, huge battle was. Not on who got the top floor or the there's 3 top floors. 3 floors who didn't get the top, and they're in the middle, but they fought over
it being as is Toronto, it was not surprising that it was the parking spots.
The parking spots
we're entitled to. Imagine that. I mean, these are multi-million-dollar units, but it's the parking
They're taking the whole floor. And they can decide on who gets the top, the middle, or the third of the top 3 floors. That's not a problem.
No.
But they're going to fight over that. They fought over parking.
It would be really interesting to know what was driving that. It's not revealed in what we were able to read in the public, out in the public space. But I would have been really curious. At work, was there an order of parking spaces? Was it something that was carrying over? A set of or a way to dominate an expression of power, I guess is what I'm looking. What was it reflecting? I can't imagine that.
Well, the other thing is when Dad passed away, Sheldon, the one with the degree, was the sort of de facto leader, right? Yeah. So he became sort of the leader. And again, when you have 4 equals, it's very difficult to have a leader. Right, when they're all perceived to be equal
in their own domains.
Yeah. So what is more important than the other? Is it because you have the degree? Is it because I didn't have a degree? What? And so this is when it comes back to the childhood. And is that the reason? Well, I don't know why you became the leader. Why didn't I become the leader? And again, this is where the problems start to arise if you don't have these discussions prior to passing away, right? And starting these succession plans and what can be done about them. But I think we tend to say, oh, well, they'll work it out. They'll fight it. You guys will figure it out. You'll figure it out. You'll fight it out, right? Do like I did and fight your way through this. But he's fighting, Dad is fighting with himself, because at this point he's not working with his brother. So it's just his decisions. And, the boys fell in line with Dad.
Well, and he was fighting a different battle. He the sons were going to have to fight with their mother still around, with one another, and the interesting thing another interesting thing that came out of that, I'm a big believer that birth order does create relationships and expectations. The birth order there was a very interesting, it was almost textbook what you would expect. You have that older child. He's probably the one who most feels the expectations of his family and wants to live out the legacy that his father and mother had not completed or the work to be done. But the youngest, always sort of the spendthrift and the gadabout. I don't know if that's in reality, I don't know if that was the case. No, we don't know, right? But you get that impression.
Maybe we should have them come on a podcast.
Well, yeah. I think that would be really interesting. And just tell us about the family dynamics.
And you know what? Because there's probably 5 stories there, right?
For
sure. They each have their own, and then there's the 5th.
Yeah.
And when you read their judge's statement at the end, and we haven't got to the part of the
no, we're just laying the groundwork.
We're just laying the groundwork. It's very juicy, honest to goodness. I'm surprised there's not going to be a movie on this.
I bet there will be
at
some.
series,
Well, there maybe has been Succession.
Yeah. Hey, listen, you know what? We are out of time on this, but can we continue this into a next podcast? Because we really haven't got into the real meat and potatoes of this.
Sure.
All right, so listen, stay tuned for part 2. We really want to get into the lawsuit and the outcome from the judge on this particular case. So we'll see you next time. If you like this episode, subscribe to the Business of Family podcast on your favorite listening platform. You can also find BlueRoots on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. On the next show, I'll be back with another amazing guest who will inspire you with their family business insights. Until then, take care and keep it in the family. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, tax, investment, or insurance advice. Before acting on any advice, please contact your personal or company advisors.